Good morning, everybody. We're going to finish up with the Greeks today, and I'm going to do a little tiny bit of a review on some of the stuff we talked about in the last lecture, because I want to lead into the Hellenistic period. You know, this is a thing I always say, which is that much as is logical humans, we like to make art history linear. It's impossible to do that. Time seems to have a way of transforming itself and morphing. And we have a different progression of cultures in different geographical areas under the same rule of people. It's impossible to pigeonhole. And so we do have Greek civilization, Roman civilization, Egyptian civilization, there's all kind of happening at the same time in the ancient world. And we study these cultures separately, and in a few selected instances, sometimes we look at cross influences and things like that, but for the most time we don't. But I like to re-emphasize the fact that these are all people and they travel, and that this is a busy, thriving culture with all of the concomitant situations that any advanced civilization will have. So we have politics in ancient Greece and in Rome and pretty much throughout Western civilization and anywhere else for that matter. And so, as we've said, during the classical period, Athens is ruled by a constitutional democracy. And there is a difference between a democracy and a republic. This isn't a government class, but it's a little bit important to understand that difference, and you can look it up if you don't know it, because it makes a difference in the way the common people interact with the government. So in this democracy, in a true democracy, if you will, as it was under the Greeks, there is power which rests in the hands of the governing citizens. So they are elected, which makes it a democracy, but they are a select group that governs. So because of this fact, women are excluded, non-citizens of Greece are excluded, and slaves are excluded. And so, like many cultures, a great proportion of the Greek city-states would have been made up of some of these other groups. So the demos did elect its governing officials, and they were meant to work in the best interest of the people, and then in return, the citizens were meant to do work for the best results of the people and the state. So in its perfection and in the logic of ethos, it's meant to be a functioning and reciprocal system. So throughout the classical period, we have this ordered response to experience. We have this character manifesting itself. We have these ideas of self-discipline, of moderation, of avoidance of excess in religious and moral thinking. Interestingly enough, very much like many of the tenets of Confucianism in ancient China. And if you ever look at non-Western art, it's interesting to draw some of those parallels. So the motto, know thyself, which actually is something we've even seen in our culture, this was a motto that arose from this time. So pathos, which is the other side of ethos, and we've talked about this in previous lectures, it's the emotional response to experience. And so during the classical period, this was equated with King Xerxes, the horrors of the Persian War, and really doesn't become prominent until the Hellenistic period, which is the reason I'm revisiting this now, because in this lecture we're going to talk about the Hellenistic period. So the victory of the Greeks over the Persians was a symbol to the classical Greeks of the victory of ethos over emotion or pathos. So, as we know, the classical period began with the invasion of Athens by King Xerxes of the Persian Empire in 481 and ended with the invasion of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great in 323. So here's our old friend, this relief of Darius and Xerxes receiving tribute from Persepolis, and look at the date, it's 491 to 486. So at the same time as Greek civilization is just beginning its inception, we have this thriving Persian Empire going on. And so it's important not to forget that. And we brought those threads all forward in Unit 1 throughout the ancient Near East and from the Egyptians. And now we're looking at its inception again with the Greeks. So again, this Persian Empire was really the first great empire in the Western civilization. And so under Darius and Xerxes, Persia had the height of its power. So that sort of sets the stage for the world at this time, if you will. So for most of the time, mainland Greece was really relatively free of Persian rule. But the Eastern Greeks in Asia Minor, in Ionia, were under Persian rule. And so there was a revolt in 499 BCE. There was a movement for independence, and there was a horrific revolt and repercussions in which all of the men were killed, all the women and children went to Asia to become slaves. I mean, it was just brutal. So the Persians turned on mainland Greece after that. And this was the war that the Greeks won. It was the first time the Greeks acted together to defeat an enemy, and this brutal just destruction of the Ionians is the cornerstone for this idea of equating pathos with the Persians. So this victory really had an important role in shaping their identity, and it guided the ethos of the classical period. So I restate this here just so you can see how important this was to them, that they really believed that they had crushed these chaotic influences. And so during the mature classical period, around 450, Athens was the central authority. And we looked at the Acropolis and Athena, and the problem was its leaders really mishandled the wealth of Greece. So, for instance, Sparta was angry about that. So war began. So you can see it didn't take long. It really didn't take long. There was a very short rule of these demos and this democracy. And this war lasted for 27 years. And there was back and forth. Once the Spartans won, they were oppressive to the Athenians. So this period of war at the end of this great classical period really hardened the Greek people. And so these great ideals that the people had, these ideals that marked this mature classical period, really just lost their way to people just trying to survive. So the art of the late classical period really emphasizes personal experience. And so this pathos takes precedence over ethos. And so these expressive works of art are evoking feelings of anguish, of tenderness, of humor, even embarrassment. And so we start seeing importance of emotion rather than just this idea of reason. At the end of the Greek Empire, after Alexander died, the empire was left with no structure at all. And so they ended out having war with powers in Macedonia, in Egypt, and Near East. We had Ptolemaic Egypt. It ends with the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE. And so this legacy of Alexander really spread Greek culture far beyond the borders of the Greek Empire. And so we had Alexandria in Egypt. So this was a great Hellenistic center of learning in the arts. And Hellenistic artists, the word Hellenistic is to spread the Greek consciousness or the Greek culture. So this Hellenistic period begins with the death of Alexander the Great, and actually it ends with the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra by Augustus Caesar. So again, we have this overlap between the Greeks and the Romans, and of course, when we look at the Roman culture, you'll see the direct influence that the classical Greeks had on the Romans. So the word to Hellenize, it means to spread Greek influence. So this art is spread throughout the known world. And we have this expanding sense of the world, this idea that the world is unpredictable, that it's dangerous. So again, I just want to reiterate this concept that because we have this expansion into this dangerous world, anything can happen at any time, that the world of reason no longer seems to apply. So the images depict pain and suffering. They show age. We no longer have this quintessential perfect human as embodied in the perfect young male nude, because that's not what the world is. There is, the cloak has been taken away, if you will. The scales have fallen off their eyes, and there is a new sense of reality. One thing that comes out in the Hellenistic period is theater. And we've always had these stadiums, but they're, very much for athletic events. But toward the end of the Greek culture, we have people like Sophocles, people like Euripides, we have playwrights, we have philosophy. So theater begins to come to the forefront. It's a vehicle for a communal expression of religious belief through music and poetry and dance. So in the 5th century, we have all kinds of tragedies in verse, and they base them on popular myths. They perform them at festivals dedicated to Dionysus in particular. And so these playwrights defined the idea of a tragic play for centuries. We really don't have any early theaters in their original form because they were used over the centuries for all different things. But we do have this theater at Epidaurus, and it's an example of a fully realized theater. It has all of its parts to it. It's got a place for the audience to sit, and then down in the bottom is the orchestra where they would have had the musicians. And then in the back, there's this vertical backdrop, the skene, that the audience would see. The proscenium is the area in front of the skene, and that's where the stage would be. And here's a visual image of this. So this would be taken from behind where the skene and the proscenium were. And you can see the orchestra is the semicircle in front of the seats. This is an image of the Temple of Zeus, and it's a late temple, and it actually ended out being completed by the Emperor Hadrian much later. It took a long time for them to complete this. These columns were invented in the 5th century, and you can see the difference on them. It only has the foliage. So the echinus is gone. It's just sort of an extension of the column shaft, and then all of these curly acanthus leaves come around it. So they only need the foliage required. The entablature actually comes out to be more elaborate. So this is an example of the Corinthian order of columns. So in Hellenistic sculpture, there's a huge variety, and we have two broad trends that are actually conflict somewhat. One leads completely away from the classical style, and some scholars call it a Pergamene style, and toward experimentation. The other leads back toward the classical style, again, by incorporating the work of earlier artists into a new interpretation. So people like Praxiteles fall under that. So this is a good example of the Pergamene style. And so these two people, they're identified as barbarians. You can see that they're barbarians because they have very wiry, unkempt hair. Think about the way the Greeks have depicted hair in all of their sculpture up to now. So this hair is flying, it's unkempt, it's sort of twisted, and their neck rings are also twisted. Their neck rings are torques. This is an example of expressionism, which expressionism is a way to elicit a specific emotional response. So this commemorates a victory over the Gauls. The Greeks very much admired these barbarians because they fought naked. And in this particular image, the Pergamene chieftain, he's killing his wife and himself. Of course, he kills her first because they would rather die than go under slavery or capture or be killed by the Greeks, that they want to die free. So the Greeks had a great admiration for this way of life. They saw it as extremely brave, and so they captured this in this sculpture. This is a dying Gallic trumpeter from around 220 BCE. So again, he is depicted naked, and so the trumpeter would be in the vanguard of the army. He would be out in the front, not on a horse, blowing his trumpet. So he would be the first to die, and he would be very, very young. This is a young boy, probably 13 or 14. So he's an individual boy, maybe somebody new. And so it's a direct emotional response of the tragedy of the death of this young boy. Gone is this heroic idea of dying at the time of perfection. This one is a Roman copy after the original bronze, and it was actually found in Julius Caesar's garden in Rome. So I like to show this here. This is also inspired by early 5th century sculpture, such as the Temple of Apphia. And you can see just by this sculpture and countless others, the importance that the Romans attributed to these Greek ideals. This sculpture is called Laocoön and His Sons, and it's an illustration of a story from the Trojan War. So the priest of Apollo, in this story, he tries to warn the people of Troy not to take the horse into the city walls. Don't take that Trojan horse, whatever you do, it's going to be the death of the city. But Athena, of course, is on the side of the Greeks, so she sent serpents to consume Laocoön and his children, which to Laocoön was a great tragedy. And so you can see this extended this contrapposto, so a far cry from the beginning of the contrapposto with polykleitos. This is taken to its full form. We can see the flexed muscles, the deep understanding of anatomy here. So this image really depicts both physical and psychological pain. So let's unpack it. Laocoön has been abandoned by his goddess, and he realized that he's also abandoned by Apollo. So Apollo gave Laocoön the gift of prophecy, but it's not doing him any good. Athena has sent these serpents to consume himself and his children. So he's going to watch his children die, and then he's going to watch his city die, and there's nothing he can do about it. So it's a complete abandonment. And for the ancient Greeks, that's utter despair. So some of the ways that the Greeks accomplish this sculptor is breaking the figures out of their boundaries, completely invading the viewer's space, and we aren't going to see this deep understanding of engagement with the viewer again until Bernini in the Baroque period, way up in the beginning of the 17th century. So it's true theater, this complex interaction of form and space. It's a complete balance of these oppositional forces. So if you look back again to polykleitos, one side balancing the other. Now, this sculptor has moved beyond doing that in a single figure in doing these contrasts of light and shade over all of these complicated forms that are carved in very high relief. So here's an example of a representation of old age. In some books, she's called Drunken Woman. She's definitely tipsy. She's got sagging skin. She's stooped over. What a contrast to that Laocoön and Sons that we saw previously, or that young boy. Three completely different figures showing three different stages of life. So at first we almost laugh at her, but then we feel sorry for her. This is the Nike of Samothrace from the Sanctuary of the Great Gods. It's 8 feet, and it's a commemoration of an important victory. Originally, it was set in a hillside niche. So this is the winged Nike, wings outstretched. We can see the forward movement, the backward thrust of the outstretched wings. This is the victory. The Hellenistic world, it's varied, it's multicultural, and artists turn from idealism to realism. So this sculpture sort of shows both because it's an idealized victory, but at the same time, the figure is naturalistic. The old woman is naturalistic. The agony is naturalistic. The attention to detail of the drapery, of the way it falls over the figure. These are all rooted in realism. So portraiture became very popular. Now, on the other hand, we have this Aphrodite of Milos, which is looking back to Praxiteles and Lysippos, much heavier proportion of this 5th century classical sculpture. We have the addition of this twisting stance, very strong projection of the knee. This is another example of the classic alternative, this Hellenistic ruler. He's a bronze figure, about 8 feet high, and so it's this Hellenistic exaggeration. It's overriding these lingering suggestions of this classical idealism. So I want to leave you with this compare and contrast. And so we have an example of 3 figures of the same subject. So on the very top left, we have the archaic dying warrior. And then on the bottom left, we have the early classical dying warrior. And then on the bottom right, we have the Hellenistic dying warrior. So look at their body postures. The upper left one, he's very stiff. He's relaxed. He's otherworldly. It's when we first looked at him, we were almost amazed at how accurate the Greeks were with anatomy. But compare that with the bottom right Gallic dying warrior, and you can notice the way now they've got a complete understanding of the way the flesh is falling away from the bones, the twisting, turning posture, the facial expression. He almost looks as though he would just move at any moment.